London, in the spring of 1814, wore its beauty like a polished mask. Gleaming carriages rolling over cobblestones, lace parasols drifting above whispering crowds, and a season hungry for spectacle. The city adored nothing so much as a story, especially one tinged with the fragrant possibility of disgrace. And on this particular morning, as a pale sky stretched across St. Bride's Church, a scandal waited like breath held in the throat of society. Eleanor Whitcomb stood at the church threshold with her gloved hands trembling inside her skirts, a bride dressed not in splendor but in modest necessity. Her gown, though carefully pressed, bore the unmistakable plainness of a family determined to spend no more than reputation required. The silk flowers woven into her hair were slightly wilted, the ribbons of her bonnet had been mended twice. She knew these details mattered. In London, they always mattered. Appearances could elevate or destroy, and she had learned painfully that those with the least power were expected to pretend they felt none of the strain. Inside the nave, guests rustled like restless foliage. Women in ivory and rose satin fanned themselves with deliberate elegance. Gentlemen leaned to exchange murmurs behind gloved hands. A bride so hesitant was already the subject of speculation. Eleanor felt their eyes prick her skin as surely as needles might. She tried to steady her breath, but the air seemed too thin, too sharp, as if even the atmosphere judged her. Her stepfather, Baronet Whitcomb, loomed at her side with a stiffness cultivated from years of entitlement. He smelled faintly of brandy despite the early hour. His grip, curled around her arm, was both possessive and punishing, a reminder that her life had long been governed by the whims of others. "Move forward," he hissed, his lips barely shifting. She tried. Truly, she did. But a tremor shuddered through her, and her slippered foot paused on the stone. That small hesitation, hardly more than a heartbeat, ignited his fury. With a swift, practiced motion, he struck her across the cheek. The sound snapped through the church like a crack of thunder. Gasps erupted in cascading echoes. Fans stilled mid-air. Eleanor recoiled, stunned by the sudden burn blossoming across her face, but more devastated by the humiliation. In a space where vows were meant to sanctify, she had been chastised like a disobedient child before half of London's nobility. Her vision blurred, though whether from tears or shock she could not tell. The baronet's face twisted with thinly veiled contempt. "Compose yourself," he muttered, as though dignity were simply a matter of will. Eleanor lowered her gaze, desperately wishing she could vanish between the stones beneath her feet. But before she could take another breath, another figure rose from the front pew, moving with the controlled precision of a man accustomed not only to authority but to its swift execution. Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ravensford, dressed in stark black tailored to intimidating perfection, stepped forward. Conversations died instantly. There was something about him, perhaps the cold clarity in his gaze, perhaps the way even silence shaped itself around him, that commanded attention without need for words. His presence was a force, and today, that force descended upon the baronet with unflinching intent. Without raising his voice or announcing his purpose, the duke lifted his hand and struck the baronet across the cheek. It was not a gesture of passion but of judgment, delivered with measured precision. The sound rang like a verdict, echoing through the vaulted ceilings with startling finality. The baronet staggered, eyes wild with astonishment. No one had ever dared treat him so. The duke stepped closer, his expression carved from quiet fury. Leaning in, he whispered something meant only for the baronet yet unmistakable in tone. "Touch her again, and I shall see you ruined before nightfall." Though spoken softly, the words unfurled with the weight of Parliament itself. Even those who could not hear them understood their significance. Eleanor stared, breath trapped in her throat. She had never spoken to the duke beyond obligatory greetings. They occupied different realms. He, the untouchable pinnacle of aristocracy. She, a girl whose fortune had crumbled long before her childhood ended. Why would he intervene? Why expose himself to scandal on behalf of a woman whose disgrace seemed all but sealed? The guests shifted like a living tide. Some were horrified, others thrilled. Scandal, after all, was the true currency of the ton. A duke delivering a public blow in defense of a powerless bride-to-be was enough to feed the city's gossip mills for months. No wedding hymn could be sung after such an act. The ceremony had died with the echo of that slap. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, and for a moment she feared she might collapse. But the Duke, still watching her stepfather with steady disdain, turned to her with an expression devoid of mockery or pity, only something resolute, inscrutable, but unexpectedly gentle. "Miss Whitcomb," he said softly, "you need not remain here." It was not a command but an invitation. A rescue. Her stepfather sputtered in outrage. "This is preposterous. She is my ward, and—" The Duke lifted an eyebrow, the smallest motion, yet enough to silence him. Authority radiated from him with the subtlety of a drawn blade. The baronet's protests crumbled under its edge. Eleanor took a breath that felt like her first real one in years. The Duke extended his arm, not touching her, simply offering presence, protection, and a path away from the shame burning across her skin. She stepped toward him. Gasps swelled again, as though society itself exhaled its shock. The church's great doors yawned open, cold morning air swirling inward as if eager to sweep her from the ruins of the life she had known. As Eleanor crossed the threshold beside the Duke, the narrator of history, had he been given voice, might have noted that nothing in London would remain unchanged after this morning, that one act of defiance had altered the course of 2 lives and awakened a rumor powerful enough to shake drawing-rooms for months. And yet, the Duke did not look triumphant. He looked troubled, as though the consequences of his own sudden action had only now begun to crystallize within him. He paused at the carriage steps, and in that breath of stillness, Eleanor sensed something unspoken, something he had not meant to reveal. Something that suggested this was not the first time he had wished to defend her. London awoke the next morning with a hunger for gossip, and Eleanor Whitcomb's ruined wedding became the brightest flame to draw every whispering moth. The scandal spread through parlors, milliners' shops, and tea-tables with astonishing speed, embroidered by each retelling until even those who had been present barely recognized the tale. Some declared the baronet had struck her hard enough to fell her. Others insisted the Duke of Ravensford had challenged him to a duel in the Isle. In truth, neither extremity had occurred, but truth mattered far less to society than the delicious spectacle of impropriety. Eleanor's name, once spoken with mild indifference, now carried the sharp edge of notoriety. She sat in a modest lodging arranged by her aunt, a kindly widow who kept her distance from scandal yet could not ignore a niece in ruin. The small sitting-room smelled faintly of lavender and coal smoke. Rain streaked the window panes like blurred ink. Eleanor held the blue cashmere shawl folded over her lap, unable to stop touching its softness. It had arrived that morning in a simple box, accompanied by a note written in a hand unmistakably precise. "You are safe now." No signature was needed. The Duke's authority clung to every pen stroke. She should have returned the gift. Accepting anything from a man, especially a duke already linked to her public embarrassment, was dangerous. Yet the warmth of the shawl defied her reason. Wrapped around her shoulders, it felt like dignity restored, an impossible comfort after the humiliation in the church. Her aunt hovered near the hearth, stirring the fire with nervous movements. "My dear, perhaps it is best to remain indoors for a few days. People can be unkind when denied fresh scandals." Eleanor managed a small nod. "I understand." What she did not understand was why the Duke had intervened with such force, or why his note carried a protectiveness she had never known, even in childhood. She lifted the fabric to her cheek, the bruise beneath still tender, and wondered if he regretted the impulsive defense that now tethered their reputations together. By noon, the answer stepped through the door. Alexander Hawthorne entered without flourish, though his presence filled the room with quiet command. His dark coat, unadorned and severe, contrasted sharply with the humble setting. Eleanor rose instinctively, unsure whether to curtsy or flee. He offered neither instruction nor expectation, simply inclining his head in greeting. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, voice tempered with gentleness that startled her. "I hope you are not in pain." Only then did she realize she still held the shawl around her shoulders. Heat rushed to her cheeks, not from the bruise this time but from embarrassment. "Your Grace, your gift is far too generous. I should not have accepted it." His gaze sharpened slightly, though not in displeasure. Generosity had little to do with it. Protection did. Her breath caught. No man had ever spoken of her safety as though it held personal significance. He stepped farther into the room, offering her aunt a polite bow before focusing entirely on Eleanor. Your stepfather has already attempted to reclaim custody of you. I have intercepted the petition. Eleanor's stomach twisted. He would force me back? He would force you anywhere that benefits him. The Duke's tone darkened. But I will not permit it. I have engaged my solicitors to ensure your independence. You will not live under his authority again. His certainty both astonished and unsettled her. Why? She whispered before she could stop herself. The Duke studied her in silence, and the fire's glow revealed a tension beneath his composed exterior. Because cruelty must be answered, he said at last. And because no woman deserves to be struck into obedience. The words pressed into her chest with unexpected weight, an affirmation she had never been offered. Yet gratitude muddled with fear. Your Grace, I do not wish to cause further scandal. People already say dreadful things. They will say worse before the week is out, he replied evenly. Their opinions do not concern me. But they concern me, she said, voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. I cannot afford more shame. The Duke's expression softened, shadows retreating from his features. Shame lies only with those who wronged you, Miss Whitcomb. Not with you. A pause followed, delicate as a held breath. If society chooses blindness, I will lend you my sight. She had no answer. Her throat tightened with an ache too complex to unravel. Fear, relief, longing, disbelief. She lowered her gaze to the shawl again, the blue fabric glowing like twilight in her hands. I have also arranged, the Duke continued gently, for funds to be placed at your disposal. Not as charity. Think of it instead as reparation for your stepfather's negligence. She stiffened. I cannot accept money, Your Grace. You can, he said, and you must if you are to live without fear. Her aunt discreetly retreated to the adjoining room, sensing the intimacy gathering between them. Eleanor forced herself to breathe evenly, though each inhale felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. I do not know how to repay such kindness, she murmured. You are not required to repay it. His growing intensity stirred something fragile inside her. She dared to meet his eyes, and in that moment the room seemed to fold inward, the rain quieting outside, the fire dimming into peripheral glow. The Duke's gaze held neither pity nor expectation, only a fierce conviction that unsettled every certainty she had clung to. He bowed his head slightly, breaking the silence. If you need anything, anything at all, you have only to send word. Before she could speak, a knock rattled the door. Her aunt reappeared, flustered, holding an envelope sealed with the baronet's crest. The Duke's jaw tightened. He wastes no time. Eleanor watched anxiously as he broke the seal, scanned the contents, and let the page curl in his hand. Anger flickered beneath the surface, colder and more dangerous than she had ever seen. He intends to challenge my intervention publicly, the Duke said quietly. He claims I acted out of inappropriate attachment. Her pulse stuttered. Attachment. The Duke lifted his gaze to hers, unreadable, profound. It seems, he murmured, your stepfather believes I have far more interest in you than I had intended society to learn. A silence swept the room, charged, breathless, its meaning yet unspoken but impossible to ignore. And for the first time, Eleanor wondered whether her stepfather's accusation struck closer to truth than either she or the Duke were prepared to admit. Ravensford House loomed beneath a broth-colored sky as Eleanor's carriage arrived, its wheels crunching over gravel slick with last night's rain. The Duke had summoned her to review documents related to her independence, though the true purpose felt heavier, threaded with the tension that had coiled between them since receiving her stepfather's accusation. She stepped into the grand foyer, where oil paintings watched like silent jurors. The air carried the faint scent of polished mahogany and burning coal, a warmth she had rarely known. A footman led her through galleries of muted splendor until she reached a quiet receiving room lit by a dozen trembling candles. Alexander Hawthorne stood at the window, back turned, posture rigid against the gray daylight. When he faced her, his expression bore a restraint she could feel even across the distance. He inclined his head with exquisite formality, yet something in his eyes, some flicker of concern or conflict, untethered her breath. "Miss Whitcomb," he said softly, "forgive the somber setting. Matters require privacy." She nodded, though her heart hammered with unspoken questions. He motioned toward a seat near the fire, where warmth reached for her like a hesitant hand. She sat, gathering her skirts, careful not to betray nerves. He remained standing, as if sitting might weaken the control he fought to maintain. "Your stepfather's claims have reached the magistrates," he began. "They will expect a formal answer." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "And what answer will you give, Your Grace?" He hesitated, a rare fracture in his composure, before replying, "The truth, naturally." But truth was not simple. Truth could be sharpened or misunderstood. The fire snapped softly, punctuating the silence stretching between them. She clasped her hands to still their trembling, but he noticed. He always noticed. "You are not in danger," he added. "Not while I have breath to oppose him." His certainty struck her with tender force. "Your Grace, this burden is not yours alone." He looked away, as though her words scraped against something raw within him. "I acted in the church because I could not bear cruelty enacted before sanctity," he murmured. "I acted afterward because I have seen too many women crushed beneath the weight of lesser men." His jaw tightened, and Eleanor glimpsed, briefly, the shadow of an old sorrow. "My sister suffered such a fate," he admitted quietly. The confession hovered like frost in the air. Eleanor had not expected such vulnerability, nor the way it shifted her understanding of him entirely. He exhaled, as if releasing years of silence. Her husband hid his brutality behind charm and rank. By the time we intervened, it was too late. Eleanor's breath caught. The grief in his voice was tempered, buried deep beneath discipline, but unmistakable. "Since then," he continued, "I have vowed that tyranny disguised as propriety will not go unanswered." She felt her eyes sting. "I am sorry," she whispered, though the phrase felt too small, too simple for the ache she sensed in him. He inclined his head, accepting the sentiment but not dwelling in it. "You need not offer pity. Only understanding." The fire's glow softened his severe features, rendering him unexpectedly human, no longer the untouchable figure society revered but a man forged by loss and sharpened by duty. Eleanor swallowed, gathering the courage trembling in her chest. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "people believe you defended me, for reasons beyond justice." His gaze returned to hers, steady, unreadable. "I know. And if they continue to believe it," she pressed, "your reputation will suffer. Mine already has." A flicker, perhaps irritation, perhaps something more dangerous, crossed his expression. "Miss Whitcomb, I am not governed by rumor." "But I am," she whispered. "Every whisper reshapes my fate." Her voice cracked, revealing the fear she tried so fiercely to hide. He stepped closer, each movement controlled yet undeniably deliberate, until he stood only a few feet away. "Look at me," he said gently. She lifted her chin. His voice lowered. "Do you imagine I would permit you to face these accusations alone?" "I cannot imagine why you would concern yourself so deeply," she replied, though her heart drummed the truth she dared not speak. His silence stretched, weighted with a confession that teetered on the cusp of expression. Instead, he turned slightly, gesturing toward the adjoining ballroom. "Walk with me." She followed him into a vast chamber of polished floors and ghostly light. Chandeliers glittered above like suspended frost, and their reflections shimmered along the floor. The room felt abandoned by music, waiting for a season that had not arrived. He stood at its center. "This hall," he said softly, "was once filled with laughter. I have avoided it since my sister's passing." Eleanor looked around, heart aching for him. "Why bring me here?" she asked. His reply was quiet, almost reverent. "Because this room deserves a new memory." He extended one gloved hand, not to touch, merely to offer guidance, as if showing her how to move without fear. She placed her fingers lightly near his, a breath's distance between skin and leather. They did not dance, yet something within her shifted, aligning with a gentler rhythm than the world had ever granted her. "You speak of protection," she whispered, "but at what cost?" His chest rose with a slow inhale. "At whatever cost is required." The word struck her like a chord played too close to the heart. Heat rose beneath her skin. Her pulse fluttered. The moment deepened, their nearness tilting the air toward something neither fully understood nor dared name. His gaze softened, no longer the distant steel she had known, but something warmer, perilously sincere. "Miss Whitcomb," he began, voice low, "if circumstances were different." A sudden knock shattered the fragile intimacy. A footman entered, bowing stiffly. "Your Grace, a courier has arrived. Urgent documents from the magistrates." The Duke stiffened. "Bring them." The footman withdrew briefly, returning with a sealed packet. Alexander broke the seal, scanning the contents with darkening eyes. Eleanor watched his expression change, not with anger this time, but with a profound, unsettling gravity. He folded the paper slowly, as though the act itself required control. "What is it?" she asked, voice barely above a breath. He looked at her, something unguarded flickering through his composure. "The magistrates request a formal inquiry," he said quietly. "They mean to examine my conduct, and yours." Her heart lurched. On what grounds? His answer fell like a whisper of fate. "On the grounds," he murmured, "that a man does not defend a woman so fiercely, unless he harbors feelings he cannot deny." The inquiry was scheduled at midday, though Eleanor felt as though the city had been holding its breath since dawn. London's sky hung in a pewter haze, threatening rain, as if even the weather wished to witness the unfolding scandal. Ravensford House stood unusually quiet when the Duke arrived at her lodging to escort her, his carriage waiting like a dark sentinel at the street's edge. He offered his arm without a word, and though propriety trembled at the closeness, she accepted. His presence steadied her, yet sharpened every fear. Today would decide her future, and perhaps his. Inside the carriage, the silence deepened. Shadows flickered across his features with each turn of the wheels, sharpening the angles of his profile. Eleanor pressed her hands together tightly in her lap. "Your Grace," she said softly, "if this inquiry harms your standing, I—" He cut her off with a quiet firmness. "Do not concern yourself with my standing." His gaze drifted to the window, though she sensed his thoughts circled far nearer. "What matters is truth." "But truth," she whispered, "is not always what people wish to see." His jaw tightened. "Then we will make them see it." The carriage halted before the magistrate's hall, a building of pale stone and cold authority, its columns rising like pillars of judgment. Crowds had gathered, eager to glimpse the players of London's most riveting scandal. Murmured speculations swirled around them as they ascended the steps. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, but the Duke's arm remained steady beneath her hand, an anchor she had not known she needed until this moment. Inside, the chamber was arranged with rigid formality. Magistrates sat in a row like carved idols. Solicitors hovered near polished desks. Several nobles had been invited to observe, their expressions guarded but hungry for drama. Eleanor's stepfather occupied a seat at the front, his smirk barely concealed. The sight of him chilled her blood. The Duke guided her to a bench before releasing her arm with the faintest hesitation, as though reluctant to sever the connection. Then he stepped forward, addressing the magistrates with impeccable poise. "I thank the court for granting us audience." His voice carried a controlled power, deep, resonant, and utterly commanding. Eleanor watched the magistrates straighten instinctively, as though unable to resist the weight of his presence. One of them, a silver-haired man with spectacles perched low on his nose, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, the matter before us concerns allegations of impropriety. It is said you intervened in the Whitcomb wedding not solely from moral indignation, but due to personal attachment." The words slithered through the chamber, leaving silence in their wake. The Duke regarded them with unflinching calm. "I intervened because a man struck a woman in a consecrated place. If such brutality does not compel immediate action, what does our society stand for?" A ripple moved through the room, agreement mingled with skepticism. The magistrate continued, "And yet your involvement did not end there. You petitioned for the young woman's independence, provided her with lodging, and offered financial support." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Each point, spoken so clinically, sounded damning despite its necessity. The Duke inclined his head. "I did. And do you deny personal interest? He paused, not long, not theatrically, but long enough for Eleanor's breath to catch in her throat. I deny nothing that honors truth, he said steadily. I will not allow malicious interpretation to distort my intentions. Miss Whitcomb was in danger. I acted. Her stepfather let out a sharp laugh. Acted as a suitor, you mean? Your behavior disgraces your title. Before anyone could interject, Eleanor rose to her feet. No, she said, her voice trembling but clear. The only disgrace on that day was your cruelty, sir. Every head turned. Fear surged through her, yet she stood taller. You treated me not as a daughter but as a burden. You struck me before witnesses. If the Duke had not intervened, I do not know what further humiliation would have followed. The baronet's face reddened with fury, but he said nothing. Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. I will not return to your household. I will not be coerced into obedience by violence. My dignity is not yours to command. A hushed awe swept the chamber. Even the magistrates exchanged glances. The Duke's expression, though restrained, held a quiet pride that warmed her from across the room. The magistrate cleared his throat. Miss Whitcomb, do you assert you acted independently, without persuasion from His Grace? Yes, she said. He has offered only protection and respect. Gifts I had not known were possible. A murmur rose among the nobles. Something shifted, the tone of the room, the balance of sentiment, the narrative itself. The magistrates conferred briefly. When they faced the assembly again, their verdict was measured but decisive. The court acknowledges Miss Whitcomb's testimony and finds no cause to condemn the Duke's actions. Guardianship will be removed from Baronet Whitcomb, and Miss Whitcomb shall receive full legal independence. Relief crashed through her so swiftly she swayed. She might have fallen had the Duke not moved to her side instantly, offering support without touching her. His nearness steadied her heartbeat, though she dared not look at him in that fragile moment. The assembly began to disperse, whispers trailing like smoke. Eleanor exhaled shakily, feeling the world tilt back into place. The Duke escorted her toward the exit, matching her pace with a gentleness she felt in her bones. Outside, the afternoon light glowed soft and pale, a fragile blessing after the storm. Eleanor paused beneath the stone archway, gathering her breath. Your Grace, she murmured, I do not know how to express what today has meant. You need not, he replied quietly. Your courage spoke more powerfully than any argument I might have made. She felt warmth bloom in her chest. He studied her face with a depth that made her pulse flutter. Miss Whitcomb, he said, voice low, there is something I must ask you now that the court has granted your freedom. She turned toward him fully, heart pounding. But before he could speak, a messenger arrived breathlessly, holding an envelope embossed with the royal crest. The Duke's expression shifted, surprise, then concern, then something darker. He broke the seal. Eleanor watched the color drain from his face as he read. When he lifted his eyes to hers, they held a truth she was not yet prepared to hear. It appears, he said quietly, your freedom has come at a cost neither of us anticipated. Eleanor stared at the Duke as the royal crest glinted sharply in his hand, its crimson wax seeming to pulse in the cold afternoon light. The crowds had thinned. The hall behind them hummed only faintly with departing footsteps and fading whispers. Yet the silence between them felt loud, pressing, expectant. What does it say? She asked, her voice fragile but steady enough to meet the weight of the moment. He hesitated, the parchment trembling almost imperceptibly in his fingers. When he spoke, his tone was carefully measured, but a thread of unease wove through it. The Crown has taken notice of the inquiry, he said. They request my presence at once. Eleanor's heart tightened. Royal notice was no trifling matter. It meant scrutiny of the highest order, judgment from eyes far more formidable than magistrates or gossiping nobles. Is this because of me? She whispered. A shadow crossed his expression. No, he replied softly, because of what I chose to do. Before she could question him further, the royal messenger bowed and excused himself. The Duke folded the letter with deliberate care, as if controlling the movement might anchor the storm rising within. We cannot speak here, he murmured. Come. He guided her to the carriage waiting at the street's edge. The sky had darkened, as though London itself anticipated a shift in fate. Rain began to fall in delicate needles, tapping the carriage roof once they were inside. For several breaths, neither spoke. Eleanor watched his profile, severe yet softened by something unspoken, something dangerously close to vulnerability. At last he turned to her. "The Crown believes I have compromised propriety," he began slowly. "They ask whether I acted as a Duke of England should, or as a man governed by feeling." The word struck her chest like a physical blow. Feeling. That single word hung between them, trembling. She struggled to find her voice. "And what will you tell them?" His gaze met hers, steady and searching. "The truth." But the truth, Eleanor realized, was no longer something she could pretend lay safely in abstraction. It had begun to take shape, breath, heartbeat. The carriage rolled through the mist toward Ravensford House, where lamplight spilled across the steps in golden arcs. When he stepped out, he offered his hand, not out of duty, but with quiet reverence. She placed her fingers in his, feeling the warmth of his skin even through his glove. Once inside, the house seemed to inhale their presence. Footmen vanished discreetly. Doors softened their clicks. It was as though the very walls wished to grant them privacy. The Duke led her to his study, where the fire crackled with an amber glow. He closed the door gently, then turned toward her with an expression she could not decipher. "Before I go," he said, "you must understand what is at stake." Eleanor stepped closer, drawn by a force she no longer wished to resist. "Tell me." He exhaled slowly. "If the Crown determines that I acted from personal motive, they may strip my influence in Parliament. They may question my guardianship petitions. My reputation, my authority, everything I rely on to protect those in need, could be compromised." She felt her pulse stutter, realizing the magnitude he had risked. "You did all this," she whispered, "for me." His eyes softened, and for a moment she glimpsed the man beneath the title, the man who had mourned a sister, struck a baronet, wrapped a shawl around a stranger's dignity. "Eleanor," he said, her name spoken not as a formality but as a confession, "I did it because I could not do otherwise." She absorbed the words slowly, every part of her trembling at their meaning. The fire flared, casting his face in shifting gold. "Your Grace, Alexander," he corrected gently. Her breath faltered. He stepped nearer, not touching, but close enough that warmth bridged the narrow distance between them. "When I saw him strike you, something in me refused to remain still." She closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the ache behind his voice. "Society will twist that into impropriety," he continued. "They will say I acted from impulse, from sentiment, from care," she finished softly. His expression changed, unarmored, raw. "Yes," he whispered, "from care." He looked away then, perhaps fearing he had gone too far. But Eleanor, gathering courage from the ashes of everything she had endured, stepped into that fragile space. "Alexander," she murmured, "I will not let them punish you for kindness. Not for protecting me." He met her gaze, searching for fear, hesitation, regret, yet found none. A slow breath escaped him, almost stunned. "Your testimony saved me today," he said. "Your strength will save me again." The words warmed her like a hand pressed gently to her heart. A knock at the door startled them. A footman bowed. "Your carriage awaits, Your Grace. You must leave at once." Alexander nodded, then dismissed him. The urgency in the moment deepened, like a drumbeat approaching its crescendo. Eleanor moved toward him, unsure how to speak what crowded her chest. "Before you go," she whispered, "you must know something as well." He stilled. "What is it?" She struggled for breath, not from fear but from the enormity of her truth. "What they accuse you of feeling. I do not find it improper, nor unwelcome." A silence, vast and electric, enveloped them. Alexander reached toward her instinctively, then withdrew, as though bound by invisible chains of honor. "If I touch you now," he said, voice trembling with restraint, "I may not find the strength to let go." She swallowed. Then do not let go. His breath caught. For an instant, the space between them collapsed into something luminous, inevitable. But he stepped back, not denying her, but preserving her. "When I return," he said quietly, "if the crown permits me to remain the man I am, then I will answer what your words have begun." Her throat tightened with emotion. "Then go," she whispered. "Return to me." He bowed his head, not in formality, but in reverence. Then he turned and walked out, the door closing softly behind him like a heartbeat sealing its vow. Eleanor stood alone in the study, firelight flickering against the walls. Outside, the carriage wheels began to roll. And with every echoing turn, she felt her fate winding itself tighter to his. But the moment she stepped toward the window, footsteps thundered in the hall. A second messenger burst through the front door, shouting urgently for the Duke, too late. Eleanor's pulse froze as she heard the cry. "Your Grace, stop the carriage. The Crown's summons has changed. They demand immediate surrender of your titles pending inquiry. There is danger, grave danger." And Alexander was already gone into the night.